What I'm going to share with you tonight deals with history specifically, and looking at history specifically, that area, the Bible is very clear about knowing our history. The Bible tells us time and time again that the way that a people views its history will affect the way that that people behaves. We're told to recall the former days, to remember the former times, and passage after passage after passage after passage after passage throughout the Scriptures tells us to know our history. So history is a very significant subject. God wants us to know that. And it's interesting that in American history, and even though we have people viewing from across the world, a lot of what I'll do tonight will be American history. However, the principles apply for anyone, any place, any point in time. It's just going to be American examples. When you look at the way that we dealt with American history for about 3 centuries, a little over 3 centuries, we had a specific view. There's a historian that has a great approach to history that we quoted very often in the 1800s. His name is Charles Coffin. Charles Coffin wrote a series of public school textbooks in the 1800s, late 1800s, 6 of them. They're still in reprint today. They're great history books. They're great for use. But at that point in time, when we didn't have teachers' colleges like we do now, what they would do is in the front of the books, they would tell you what the teacher needed to know to teach that course. So in the front of a math book, the author of the math book would say, here's how you teach the course, or English, or whatever it was, they would be in front. In the front of his first history book, in this series of 6 history books he did, this is what he told teachers, and it's really a good view. He says, notice that while oppressors have carried out their plans in history, there were other forces silently at work which in time undermined their plans, as if a divine hand were directing the counter plan. In other words, what you'll see in history very often is things are moving in a particular direction, they'll suddenly take an unexpected turn and end up at a place that no one saw that coming. Quite frankly, it was that way in the American Revolution. There's no way that 56 individuals, being shopkeepers and school teachers and farmers, can take on the world's greatest military power and prevail. It's just not going to happen. It won't happen anywhere at all, but it did happen. But it's interesting to see the things that happened along the way. For example, early in the Revolution, when the British generals were veterans, these guys, the best military in the world, most powerful military in the world, best trained, best experienced, they have the infant American army trapped out on Long Island. And instead of doing what any good military leader would do, and that is when you get the enemy trapped, crush them, take care of them right then, put this thing to bed. When you get your foot on the neck of an enemy, you don't let them up. They said, there's no use capturing the Americans today. We'll do it in the morning. We got plenty of time. They can't go anywhere. They're all trapped in there. And so they didn't do what any good military leader would have done. And in the process of not doing that, a fog comes rolling in. That fog comes rolling in, and Washington and his troops are out trapped on that peninsula. And Washington sends guys out to find every boat they can up and down that coastline. They brought all these boats back. They loaded all his troops on. They got them off. They're going across the bay. And the next morning, as the fog lifts, the only thing the British see is the last boat going over the horizon. Now, there's no way that they should have made a stupid decision like that, but that happened regularly throughout the American Revolution. Things were heading in one direction, and then suddenly it's like they get this idea and they do something. It's nuts. It's the same way in the Civil War. The first 3 years of the Civil War, they were kicking tail over the Union, no question about it. And then about halfway through, things start to change, and you get to battles like the Battle of Pea Ridge. In the Battle of Pea Ridge, Confederates were again whipping the Union until the Confederate generals forgot to send ammunition to the troops on the front line. Now, who forgets to send ammunition to troops on the front line? I mean, come on. This happens all the time when you see things moving in the direction they suddenly, because there is a divine hand directing the counter plan. That God is going to have a different outcome than what it looks like, and so things suddenly turn. And if you don't recognize that feature that God sometimes will turn things in history, you'll never understand history. He continues. He says, whoever peruses the story of liberty without recognizing this feature will fail of fully comprehending the meaning of history. You'll never understand history if you don't understand that God has purposes and times and places and things that He is working out. He continued, he says, there must be a meaning to history, or else existence is an incomprehensible enigma. Now, that's one of the reasons that history has become such a boring subject today, because it no longer has meaning to it. It no longer has purpose. We no longer show where things were headed. We have a series of dates and names and places. And who cares about a bunch of dates and names and places, because it doesn't have meaning or purpose anymore. But this is the way we used to teach history, was with a providential view. We wanted to see what God was up to in history. In a similar means, if you go to this man, this is George Bancroft. He is called the father of American history. In 1841, he's the guy as a historian that said, you know, we need a systematic history of the United States. So he put together a 10-volume set, used all the documents he could. It's the first real systematic history we had of America. That's why he's called the father of American history. By the way, he's also the Secretary of War. He's the guy who founded the Naval Academy in Annapolis. That's why the major hall there is called Bancroft Hall, named after him. But here's the father of American history, and look what he says about history. Same message. He says, the fortunes of a nation are not under the control of blind destiny, but they follow the steps by which a favoring providence, calling our institutions into being, has conducted the country to its present happiness and glory. Anytime you look at national history, you need to see what God is doing in the nation, what he's been up to, what has caused him to respond the way he does, the institutions, everything that's going, as he says, our happiness and our glory. You have to look and see what God was up to. There is another historian from the founding era. His name is Jedidiah Morse. He actually is one of the top 3 educators in the founding era. He's actually called the father of American geography. He was an early, he held an early position in the federal government. So, and by the way, it's his son, Samuel F.B. Morse, that developed the Morse code, all the technology that goes with that. So you go back to the founding era, and he is a theologian and an educator in the founding era. And this is what he said about the office of historian. He says the office of historian is to do 3 things. What is it that a historian is supposed to do? He says the office of historian is, number 1, to record the progress of human affairs as directed by the providence of God. Number 1 objective of a historian is to record what God's up to. The providence of human affairs is directed by the hand of God. He says, number 2, he says, is to exhibit the connection of events, showing how an immediate series is produced by cause and effect. Now, see, when you get into cause and effect, you start talking about purpose. This is what we do not talk about in American history. We sometimes talk about American exceptionalism. Question is, what produced it? That's the effect from which cause. Most people have no clue what produced American exceptionalism. Most people have no clue what produced most things that go on in history. Again, we study a series of disjointed, disconnected dates and names and places, and we don't like showing purpose of history because that would have values. That would be imposing our values on someone else. We want you to interpret values for yourself, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, how this is done today, both in media and in government and judiciary and other places as well. So those are the first 2 things. The third thing that historians do is to display the character of man and of God. Now, this is the way that we always believed history was to be taught in America. This is the way we always went at it. This is what a historian was to record. As you saw with Charles Coffin, George Bancroft, other leading historians, this is the way we taught and the way we presented American history. Because of that, I love the way that it's summed up by Supreme Court Justice. This justice, Justice James Wayne, was put on the U.S. Supreme Court by President Andrew Jackson, and this is what he said. He said, history is fill in the blank. Now, maybe you're a history teacher, maybe you know a definition of history, and I'm not sure, perhaps, but I wonder if your definition of history is the same that we used back then at this point in time. Again, early 1800s. He says history is what? He says history is God's providence in human affairs. Now, that's the definition of history. History is the story of what God's been up to in the lives of individuals and peoples and nations, and it's really looking at what he's been doing. Now, when you see it in that way, this is what we would call providential history. And this is the way we taught American history for more than 3 centuries. We never thought about being secular in approach because history is really the story of what God's been up to in the life of the nation. But over the last 50 to 60 years particularly, we've had all sorts of groups say, whoa, you can't teach that kind of history, especially in public schools. And so you get the folks like the revisionists saying, no, it didn't happen that way. You get folks like the secularists saying, no, 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 God has no place in history. This is a secular course of study. You get the same thing from atheists who file lawsuits if you try to teach God in the classroom or even repeat history, and you try to teach documents. The cases we've seen out in California where a teacher actually posts documents, but because they have the word God in them, he gets a lawsuit filed against him. He can't teach history if it mentions the word God. And so you've got all these groups, and that's expected. But what's been interesting is in the last 20 to 30 years, you've also had lots of Christians join in and say, hey, you can't teach this kind of stuff. Now, why in the world would Christians join with all these other groups to say you shouldn't be teaching providential history? I mean, why would Christians join in to say you got to keep history secular? You can't show. And the answer is probably found in a great passage that Jesus gave us in Luke 6:40, where he says, every student, when he is fully trained, will be like his teacher. What happens is you got a whole lot of profs at Christian schools that were trained by really secular guys. And every student, when he's fully trained, will be like his teacher. And so what happens is all these guys go through and get their PhDs, but they've been trained by really secular-minded, higher criticism type type guys, and then when they get there, they just communicate on to these Christian kids or whatever kind of kids they've got, whatever they've been taught. Now, within this context of doing this, you may be aware that the most dangerous place in the United States today for any Christian youth particularly is university, college or university. If you're aware of Rothman Lichter, for years Rothman Lichter kept up with the worldview of media, but recently they've gone and looking at the worldview of professors. And while we've always known that the worldview of media is liberal and left and progressive, boy, they make, the professors make the media look really conservative compared to where professors are. Professors are so much further left. And that's why, depending on which study you look at today, somewhere between 71 and 88% of Christian youth will deny their faith while at college. So we're losing 71 to 88% of Christian kids who go to four-year college, kids raised in Christian homes, 71 to 88% will deny their faith. There's a lot of hostility out there. We actually have several legal groups. I work with several legal groups that do nothing but defend kids whose faith is singled out at college. How many of you are Christians? Raise your hand. You won't be when you leave my class. That's the announcement professors make to Christian kids at college. Find out what they believe. He'll ask them key questions, knowing what Christians believe, and then he'll nail them with questions they can answer. They're not equipped in apologetics, and they should be. This is one of the things we've really become sloppy in recent years. Kids know what they believe. They don't know why they believe what they believe. They can't do the 1 Peter 3:15 thing of give a reason for the hope that's within you. I even do this to a lot of parents nowadays. I'll ask parents and say, hey parents, how many of you believe in the virgin birth of Christ? Everybody raises their hand and says, give me 5 reasons you believe that. I haven't had a parent give me a reason yet. Well, if parents don't know it, how do they equip their kids to be able to do that? Because when that kid gets to school, the prof will say, hey, you believe in the virgin birth? Oh, yeah, I've been taught that all my life. Do you realize how stupid that is? I mean, think about it. It is impossible. Mary became pregnant and had no sexual relations. No. You've been, and they just mock them and make fun of these kids. And somebody with 14 PhDs nails these kids with questions they've never been equipped to answer. And so suddenly, that's why we lose 71 to 88% of them. They don't understand apologetics. We've not equipped them for that. But you know what's amazing? Now, in recent years, in the last 15 to 20 years, we now know that over half of the kids at Christian schools, Christian colleges and universities will renounce their faith as well. Now, how does that happen? I mean, why are we losing half our kids that go to Christian schools? Because the professors who are at the schools have been trained by the same secular guys that are so hostile and so many other, and they're injecting all this higher criticism and doubt and no, God's not involved and impersonal God. I mean, we're seeing this at Christian universities all over the nation. So that's what we get a lot of. And by the way, that's why today, if you do something like try to put God in history, you're going to get nailed. A book that we did, Jefferson Lies, made all sorts of national news because all these professors came, oh, no, Jefferson didn't believe in God. He wasn't religious. He's a great atheist. I mean, they went bonkers when we went back through and showed all the things that Jefferson did. And I'll talk about a few of those things tonight. But man, if you try to get God back into the position that we had him in history for 300 years, it just drives these PhDs nuts. Now, there are some good PhDs. There's some good professors out there, great guys. But by and large, that profession as a whole is now the most hostile to God things of any profession in the nation. So in doing that, what I want to do is look at what happens with history today, because I've been appointed in a lot of states by state boards of education to write history and government standards for the students in those states. So I see history textbooks, I see history standards, I deal with governors, I deal with state boards of education. And in dealing with them, I've learned that there are 4 historical traps that I look for when I deal with history. I want to tell you about these traps tonight because once I show you what they are, you'll be able to recognize them instantly. And the reason it's good to talk about traps goes back to a Bible verse in 2 Corinthians 2:11, where the Scripture tells us we're well aware of his traps so that we won't be taken advantage of by Satan. You see, what it is if you know what a trap is, you won't fall into it, or you're less likely to fall into it. Now, I'm a cowboy. I live out in the country. We live on a ranch. We've got all sorts of varmints we try to take care of on a regular basis. The top 2 rabies-carrying animals in the world live on our ranch. We've got 4 poisonous snakes in America, and they all live on our ranch. I mean, we got lots of varmints that we have to be careful of. So because of that, we set traps. There are traps we use. And you see, the thing that makes a trap work is the fact that what you're trapping doesn't recognize as a trap. Once a wild pig learns what a trap looks like, he won't go into it anymore. Once a skunk learns what a trap looks like, they won't go in. The only reason traps work is because you don't recognize what they are. Once you recognize what they are not effective. See, that's what 2 Corinthians 2:11 talks about, is that we recognize the traps, Satan won't have an advantage on us. If we know what his traps look like, we won't fall into those traps, or at least we're a lot less likely to fall in those traps. So I want to identify the 4 traps, the 4 traps that we deal with in history especially. And by the way, you'll also recognize these traps in media and in government and in politics, policy making. This is kind of worldview kind of traps, if you will. The 4 traps, these are names that I'll identify: post-structuralism, modernism, academic collectivism, and deconstructionism. And that sounds like a big highfalutin academic discussion about to come. It's not so. Once I show you the definitions of each of these, you'll have an aha moment and go, yeah, I know exactly what that is. So let me jump into the first one. Let me take the first one. The first one is post-structuralism. Post-structuralism says there are no transcendent values in history or government. Each individual must interpret them for himself according to the standards that he makes for himself. Now, we see this all the time in lots of stuff, but it's especially in history. And let me give you an example where it's not in history. Just take judiciary. This is the philosophy that leads to what we call the living Constitution. Remember the living Constitution? I'll make and judge the standards for myself. What about that document you swore to uphold? No. I swore to uphold the Constitution. Yeah, you did. But you see, here's the problem if you have a post-structural view of the Constitution. If you look at what Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes said about this, this is what Chief Justice Hughes said. He says, we are under a Constitution, but, and you got to hate it when that word comes up. Anytime they bring the word but up, you know it's about to go in an opposite direction. He says, we are under a Constitution, but the Constitution is what the judges say that it is. That's post-structuralism. You see, that's how a judge in Iowa, 7 judges in Iowa, can look at the Iowa Constitution and say, you know what, we think the Iowa Constitution protects gay marriage and we're going to have it in Iowa. Now, you got to, and this is what they wrote. They said, you have to understand that we have now discovered rights that were hitherto unknown in our Constitution. If they weren't in there, how did you discover them? Because we have a set of values that we see. This is post-structuralism. I will determine my values for myself, and since I have a position of authority, you're all going to live under my values. So this is a difficulty. That's the way it works in judiciary. So one is that they determine values for themselves, which, by the way, is why we don't put God in history anymore, because when you put God in history, you talk cause and effect, you're talking absolute values. There are rights, there are wrongs, and you can't say that if everybody gets to make their own values. And so that's literally what we teach now is post-structuralism, which is you decide your own values. What works for you may not work for anybody else, but if it works for you, then you can't do that. God has absolutes. History has absolutes. We've always taught those, except in American history the last 50 years. Second aspect of post-structuralism, in addition to having no transcendent values, the second aspect of it, it says persons have value not on the basis of who they are individually, but rather on the basis of the groups with which they identify. The group becomes more important than the individual. That's post-structuralism. Now, we see this in politics all the time. It's called identity politics. Identity politics says, what group are you from? I don't know how I'm supposed to think about you until I can see what label you have, what group you're with. And whatever group you're from tells me what I believe about you. I don't believe anything about you because you're an individual. I have to know the group to which you belong. And because we have to know the group to which you belong, we have to make laws based on the group to which you belong, which is how we get, for example, hate crime laws. Now, when the federal Congress passed the hate crime laws back in 2006, they said, we want to protect gays and lesbians from hate crimes. So as that law was going through Judiciary Committee, one of my friends in Congress who sits on the Judiciary Committee offered an amendment to that hate crimes law. He says, I want to amend this. I think we should also add veterans and seniors into protection from hate crimes. And they said, no, those aren't the groups we're trying to protect. The groups we're trying to protect are gays and lesbians, not veterans and seniors. I see. So we protect some groups and not others. See, the problem with hate crimes is we have to decide what groups we're going to protect. Now, if you treated everybody like an individual, everybody would be protected from hate crimes, but we don't need that. We need special identification of which group you're with. This is something that we see a lot of, not only with hate crimes, but even with tax policy. You see, tax policy, we have to know what group you're from before we tax you. See, progressive taxation says it's a different tax for different groups. Now, God taxes people as well. It's called a tithe, but He taxes everybody the same, 10% across the board, rich or poor. Now, granted, if you make $1 million, $100 million a year, your tithe is going to be $10 million. If you only make $100 a year, your tithe is going to be $10. The rich will pay more than the poor, but everybody's treated exactly the same. Scripture says the sun shines on the just and the unjust, the rain falls on the wicked and the righteous. That's the way tax is. That's the way the Founding Fathers set up the Constitution. 1789, when that Constitution was ratified, it provided for capitation taxes, which is like a tithe. Everybody pays the same thing. We treat everybody the same. But in 1913, with the 16th Amendment, we said, no, we're going to do progressive income tax. Now we have to find out what group you're with. Once we know what group you're with, we'll know how to treat you. Because if you're a different group from this guy, see, this is post-structuralism, where we treat groups differently from one another rather than being equal. Everybody's equal. No, if you're from a different group, if you got the right label or the wrong label, we'll treat you differently. So that's post-structuralism. So value on the basis of the group with which I identify. The third thing that deals with post-structuralism is it separates. What it does is it separates you from the concept of nationalism. You're not part of a nation. Nation, that's too provincial. You're much bigger than what you have in a nation. And so what we do is we look at the group rather than the nation. We don't care what nation you're from. We care what group you're with. And so what we've done is taken the Latin phrase on the Great Seal that says e pluribus unum, which means out of many we become one, and we've exactly reversed it to where that we say, well, it's e unum pluribus. Out of one we become many. So we don't have continuity, we don't have unity, we look to divide and set one group against another. So I have to know, are you liberal or conservative? Are you union or you right to work? You gay, you straight? Are you black, you white, Hispanic? Are you Mormon, you Catholic, you Jew? So we have to know what group you're with. If I can figure out what group you're with, then I'll know what I'm supposed to think about you. And you'll find that that's instantly the way we respond. We hear certain key words and we think about that group. No, there's a lot of people that are in groups that don't fit the label that goes with that group. You know, I can give you lots of examples, but there's just a lot. I'm not going to go into it, but you can think through a lot of examples. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to keep moving here. Now, when we were doing the history standards in Texas, and I was one of the 6 expert reviewers appointed by the state board to do that, Texas is a conservative state, and yet look what we had to deal with. Now, the process works that 240 teachers in Texas write the standards. They give it to the State Board of Education. State Board of Education brings the 6 of us in. We look at it, make recommendations. We go back to the State Board. They will amend it, however, and then it goes to the publishers, and they do the textbooks. So when you look at what we had in the state of Texas, this is one of the things that reflected post-structuralism. The very first line in kindergarten, very first starting line in kindergarten, look what it said. In kindergarten, and everything in green is what they put in, everything in red is what they took out from the last time. In kindergarten, the study of the self, home, family, and classroom establishes the foundation for responsible citizenship in a global society. How about being part of America first? And in our case, part of Texas. No. We don't care about being part of Texas. We care about being part of that globe. See, we don't want nationalism. We can't have nationalism. See, first grade's exactly the same thing. And the other thing that's reflected on post-structuralism was, as we were going through and looking at what we're to teach kids, this is what the teachers want to teach. The student understands the contributions of people of various racial, ethnic, and religious groups to the United States. Does that mean that if you're not one of those groups, you didn't make any contributions to the United States? You only made contributions if you belonged to some group? We used to look at what individuals made. See, in the state of Texas, what they did, they said, oh, by teaching groups, we can have diversity. We can get blacks and Hispanics and whites. And we said, no. What we're going to do is if somebody made a significant contribution, we're going to talk about that person regardless of who they are. So under their way of doing post-structuralism, which is to identify the group so we can have diversity, out of all the hundreds of heroes that we set forth in those standards, 9% of them were minority heroes. Under our way, where we said if they did something good, we're going to talk about them, it suddenly went to 25% of the heroes were minority heroes. We tripled the amount, not because we tried to, but because we simply told the story of what individuals did. And when you start pointing out what individuals do, it's a cool story. Kids like that. That's something they can model, something they can deal. But you see, post-structuralism divides us into groups, and it says, national stuff, that's not really good. And just to show you how we used to emphasize the opposite of this, let me take you back to the year 1919. 1919 is the year after World War I is over. We have a war-torn, war-ravaged Europe. People want to come to America and get out of there. They're tired of the war and all the devastation. So they come to America, and in America, the chief of naturalization wrote this book because we have all this influx of refugees after World War I. It says how to become an American citizen. This is all the immigration laws. Because we got so many coming in, read this book and you'll know what you need to do legal-wise to become an American citizen. Now, interestingly, in 1941, this book was reprinted. And it was reprinted not because we were in World War II yet, It was reprinted because back in '36, Hitler had started moving across Poland, Czechoslovakia, everywhere else. And so we had another influx of refugees coming from Europe. And so they brought the book back out and said, well, we got all these guys coming in, so let's tell you what the laws are so you'll know how to become a citizen. Look what it tells you right up front in this book. Now, this is American policy. This is the naturalization immigration chief. This is what he says about it. He says, an American is a man who is greater in his soul than in his class, creed, political party, or the section in which he lives. To be an American, a man must have an American soul and believe in the spiritual realities upon which America rests and out of which America was born. It says, America was created to unite mankind by those passions which lift and not by those passions which separate and debase. We came to America to get rid of the things that divide and make sure of the things that unite. Does that sound like what we do today? No, we divide like crazy. That is post-structuralism. See, that's what we do in our textbooks. We divide ourselves into groups. We divide ourselves into segments. We're not part of a nation. By the way, in the Texas History Standards, they recommended that we take out the Liberty Bell, take out Nathan Hale, take out anything that relates to patriotism, because we don't want to be loyal to a country. We want a global society divided into separate groups all across the world. So this is something you see. We see it in politics all the time. This is the politics of division as you divide. It's what we do with hate crimes rather than treat everybody individually. So this is one of the things that is a trap. Now, this particular trap, interestingly, it emphasizes groups and group rights rather than individual rights, and it divides rather than unites. Now, if this is one of the traps, what's the solution for avoiding the trap? That's pretty simple. The Bible always gives a solution for how to get out of trouble. We see a trap. What's the way to avoid the trap? There's no temptation taken us, but such is common to man, but God's provided a way that we can avoid that trap. The simple way to avoid post-structuralism is to remember Jesus died for the individual, not for the group. Do not think group, think individual every time. Ignore the labels of someone else where, I'm a liberal. I don't know if you are or not. I need to know you and get to know what you believe, and then I'll say if you're a liberal or not. I'll judge a tree by its fruits, not by its label. If a tree says, I'm a banana tree, but it keeps producing apples, what are you going to believe? The label or the fruit? You judge a tree by its fruits. Ignore the labels. So that's the first thing. Jesus died for individuals, not for groups. Groups don't matter at all. In the same way, there's individual salvation. There is not group salvation, and it's individualism, not collectivism. God doesn't do things for groups. He does things for individuals all the way through. So that's the first trap. The second trap that I'll point your attention to is called modernism. Modernism examines historical incidents as if they had occurred today, and historical persons as if they lived today rather than in the past. It separates history from its context and its setting. Good way to explain this is, let me take something like the United Methodist. United Methodist, out of all the Christian denominations today, this is one of the more socially liberal denominations. The positions they hold on gay marriage, on abortion, etc., socially liberal. And as we all know, the founders of the Methodist movement were folks like George Whitefield and the Wesleys, John and Charles Wesley. Now, you know what this proves? This proves that George Whitefield and John and Charles Wesley were pro-gay and pro-abortion because they founded the Methodist Church. And if the Methodist Church is that way, we know that's what they believe because they founded it. No, Methodist Church has changed a whole lot in 200 years. Matter of fact, they've changed so much, I bet you 99.9% of Methodist churches today would not let George Whitefield come into their pulpit. And he's one of their founders. There's no way they would let him because of all the things he did back then. See, this is what happens is things that have the same name change over time. And we look at the way it is today and say, oh, it's always been that way. See, the same thing happens when you look at Quakers. Well, William Penn's a Quaker. He must be socialist. No, I guarantee you, William Penn would not be a Quaker today if he were alive because that church has moved so far away from biblical positions that he helped establish when he founded it. Really good on the Bible. You read all his writings, man. He is a Bible-thumping evangelical. There's no way that characterizes Quakers today. And then I get a lot of folks who say, you know, Unitarian Universalists, a lot of the founders were Unitarians, and that proves they weren't Christians because you can't be a Christian and be Unitarian. Don't say that unless you know what happened to the Unitarians in 1789 and 1819 and 1839. If you don't know that, don't tell me the Founding Fathers can't be Christians because they were Unitarians, because Unitarian 1879 in 1789 is nowhere close to where we are. Even in 1819, it's not the same. It was not until 1839 that the Unitarians moved in the direction of universalism, which is all roads lead to heaven, believe anything you want, Jesus is not divine. No, you go back and read their doctrines in 1789, and you can't tell but what maybe it's not a Baptist church you're reading the doctrines of in 1789. See, if you don't understand that they changed over time, people look, they say, oh, Founding Fathers, there's no way they could have been Christians because several of them are Unitarians. No, actually, Unitarian back then was, let's have unity in the body of Christ. Instead of having so many denominations fighting each other, why don't we just kind of get together and stop fighting one another? It was really what you might call a non-denominational movement. It was made up of, these were the guys who took on the atheist, and when Thomas Paine wrote against religion, it was the Unitarians who tore his head off, said, how dare you attack the Bible? And they defended the Bible. They were the ones who went against the skeptics. They were the ones who stood up to the deist. See, you wouldn't think that today. But see, that's what modernism does. It says the way it is, the way it's always been. Now, another example of that is this book, The Maxims of George Washington. This book came out, and actually it came out originally in 1855. It was based on the 1832 volume of Washington's writings that came out by Jared Sparks. That's the first collection of the writings of George Washington, 12 volumes. So in 1855, Frederick Schroeder took all the great quotes of George Washington out of those 12 volumes and made it into this book, The Maxims of Washington. Well, it's been out since 1855. They reprinted the book in 1987. And in talking about Washington's religious maxims, his religious maxims, they have a professor that talks about Washington's religion overall. And this professor that introduces us to Washington's religion, he tells us that, like many deists, Washington, and so he starts off by telling us Washington is a deist. Now, why would he say that Washington is a deist? Well, he explains it to us. He says he's a deist because he uses terms like divine providence and divine author of our blood. And so, now, this little thing about the Founding Fathers used the term providence a whole lot, and therefore it proves they're deist. I get this from professors all the time. You look at literally the language of the founders, and it uses terms like providence and like almighty overseer and things like that. But that's an interesting thing. By the way, let me show you some of the quotes of academics who point this out. It says, the Declaration mentions nature's God and divine providence. That's the language of deism, not of Christianity. Christianity would have put Jesus Christ in there somewhere. Christianity would have put the Redeemer of man. But no, they didn't do that. They used things like nature's God and divine providence. Here's another professor. It says, Washington preferred titles such as the divine author of our blessed religion, almighty being, providence, and grand designer. All terms from deist beliefs. And I can keep going on and on. Now, what makes them think that these are deist beliefs? Well, real simply, it's because you look at what we have today. When you look at what we have today with folks like the guys we see on TV, pastors and televangelists, they're always saying, now the Bible says, name me any prominent pastor or televangelist on TV that uses the word providence very often. Nobody does it today. So therefore, since evangelicals today don't use that term, there's no way that it was ever used in previous generations. And you know, the problem with that is this little Bible right here. This is called the Geneva Bible. It was printed first in 1560, and from 1560 to 1644, it went through 144 reprints. This is the book that our early forefathers brought to America. You see the Pilgrims. This is the painting that hangs inside the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol. This painting is 14 feet high. It is 20 feet wide. It is a life-size, massive painting of the Pilgrims. And they're gathered around a Bible, and the Bible is so big in the Capitol you can actually read the words on the Bible. And if you do, you find out it's a Geneva Bible. And see, Robert Weir, when he painted that, wanted to paint the Geneva Bible in because that's the Bible they brought with them to America. The Geneva Bible, what makes the Geneva Bible significant is all the commentaries around it. You see those commentaries all around there? That's the commentaries of all the reformers. That was Zwingli and Calvin and Luther and Knox, and that was Hughes, and it was Cranmer and More, and all these reformers. That's their comments, and they were challenging the culture of the day. And it's interesting that they keep using the word providence. Matter of fact, the Geneva Bible uses the word providence 100 times in the Bible. Now, I checked editions of the Bible online just in the last week or so. I've only found just a couple of editions of the Bible that even use the word providence anymore at all. But you go back to the most popular Bible in their day, it uses the word providence 100 times. You know what that means? That is biblical language. The word providence is right out 100 times in their Bible. If you'll read the sermons of George Whitefield, or you read the sermons of Jonathan Edwards, remember Sinners in the Hand of Angry God? You read those sermons, they keep using the word providence. So are we saying that these most evangelical preachers were also deists because they used the word providence? No. What we say is the Founding Fathers were using evangelical terms in the day, but our terminology has changed over 200 years. So modernism says, oh, no, these guys, they're all this. See, that's exactly why we did the Founders' Bible. We let the Founding Fathers do the commenting on all these Bible verses, and they're Bible verses we haven't thought about in this generation in 50 to 100 years. I mean, we've got this Founders' Bible loaded up with their comments, and then by the time you look at the history and see all the verses they quoted, you go, my gosh, they've got really good insight. I mean, they tell you from the Bible what taxes are right and what taxes are wrong. Bible's not against taxes, but it's against certain kinds of taxes. Bible's against a capital gains tax. It's against an estate tax. It's against a progressive tax. Bible's not against capitation taxes. The Bible's really clear on what you're supposed to do with education. They talk all about that. Bible's really clear on forms. There's 7 different forms of government. What does the Bible prefer out of 7 forms? See, that's the discussions they had back then that they wrote down that they gave Bible verses to. We don't have those discussions anymore, but we did back then. So that's what we've covered in the Founder's Bible. But going back to this, see this thing about, oh, he used the word providence, and that proves he's a deist. That's pure modernism. I mean, that is nothing but modernism when they say that. So I say that because that's another trap we get into. We take what's right now and act that it's been that way all across history, and that simply is not the case. Now, how do you get out of the trap of modernism? If modernism, it's simply, you just know history. You call to remembrance the former days, you remember the days of old, you consider, if you know what happened back then, you don't buy into the trap of, oh, here's what they are today because that's the way we interpret it. That's the second trap that we see a lot of. The third one gets a lot more fun. This is where I can have a lot more fun with specifics. Academic collectivism. It's a heavy reliance on peer review as the almost exclusive standard for historical truth. Experts quote each other and those from their group rather than consulting original sources. We are an expert-laden society. You see, because we've got 24/7 news, you know, we have something that happens, well, we're going to cover that event in the news cycle probably 5 times over the course of the day. We need a different expert for each time. So we go out and get somebody to appear on camera for 2-3 minutes and tell us all about what's happened. Now, how do we know they're an expert? Well, because the CG at the bottom of the screen, the lower third, says they're an expert. Well, we don't know. There's so many experts on TV now, we don't know who they are, but we just defer to them because they're the experts. They know what they're talking about. And so what's happened is we've come to a point where we defer to people who appear to have credentials more than whether they have truth. We don't go check them out after every interview they do on TV. We just assume that they're experts and therefore telling us the truth, and that assumption is what gets us in a lot of trouble. Now, I recently finished an academic book with 3 other PhD professors, and it was a look at religion in early America. And in looking at religion in early America, I said religion played a big role. And they said, no, it didn't play a role. And I'm the non-PhD in the group. These guys are all the experts. And so we wrote, each one of us had a section of the book, and so we interacted and we criticized the others and agreed with the others or whatever. And so I said religion had a big role, and they said, no, it didn't. And one of the proofs that they gave that religion did not have a big role in the founding of America was dealing with Thomas Jefferson, because they said Jefferson's just a typical founding father, they said, and Jefferson is so secular that when he formed the University of Virginia, it was the first purely secular university in America. That tells you how secular he is. One of our leading founding fathers formed the University of Virginia first purely. Now, they said, how do we know it's a secular university? Because it had absolutely no chaplain at the university. The fact it had no chaplain, the only university in that age to have no chaplain, this proves just exactly how radical Jefferson and the founding fathers were. They didn't want religion to have anything to do with it, and so on they go. Well, because we own 100,000 documents from before 1812, I just had a lot of fun. I went over and just picked up some original documents, started bringing documents out, and I brought over some newspapers. And the newspapers were ads that had been run in Washington, D.C. newspapers for the brand new University of Virginia. And these ads were trying to recruit kids from D.C. to come down and go to school at the University of Virginia, because it's not that far from D.C. to University of Virginia. So that's a good place for them to get students. And in looking at the ads, here's one of the ads. And their ads back there are a lot more like op-ed pieces. It's not like the ads we see today. I mean, this is an ad. And it's signed at the bottom by Septimus Tustus. And he is the chaplain of the university. Now, wait a minute. I thought they didn't have a chaplain. What's a chaplain doing an ad? It's not that he just does an ad. He tells the students what they're going to get if they come to the University of Virginia. You see here, the chaplains tell them this. This is what he tells them. He says, "It has been my pleasure on each returning Sabbath to hold up before my enlightened audience the cross of Jesus, all stained with the blood of him that hung upon it as the only hope of the perishing." Whoa, that's the University of Virginia? I thought that's our first secular university in America. Oh, really? See, that's because they've all been telling each other that. They all have PhDs, they've been studying each other. They don't go back to original documents, but they're really good at studying each other and quoting each other. Pulled out another newspaper. Here's another ad that came out of one of the papers. See here, I'm going to pull out this part in the middle. Look what it says. Again, this is by the chaplain. It says, "Religious services are regularly performed at the university by a chaplain." That can't be. They don't have a chaplain. "Religious services regularly performed at the university by a chaplain who is appointed in turn from the 4 principal denominations of the state." See, that's what made them different. Rather than having a chaplain from one denomination, They said, you know, Virginia has got Baptists, and it's got Presbyterians, and it's got Methodists, and it's got Episcopalians. We'll just have the chaplain rotate every year from one of those 4 denominations, because we're going to be the first school in America not founded by a single denomination only for that purpose. See, William and Mary was founded by Anglicans for Anglicans. Harvard University and Yale were both founded by Congregationalists for congregations. Brown University is founded by Baptists for Baptists. Transylvania is founded by the Church of Christ for the church, by the disciples. I mean, all of them had one denomination. University of Virginia is the first one to say, nope, we're going to invite all denominations there, so our chaplain's going to rotate between all 4. Now look what else it says. It says, who's appointed in turn from the 4 principal denominations of the state, and by a resolution of the faculty, ministers of the gospel and young men preparing for the ministry may attend any of the schools without the payment of fees to professors. In other words, if you're studying for the ministry, tuition free at the University of Virginia. We'll take you right in, tuition. Wait a minute, I thought this was a secular school. Why are they giving religious preference to kids who are studying for the ministry? Because that's academic collectivism. They keep telling each other that that's a secular school. You go back to the original documents, you get a whole different view. I'll give you another one that deals with Thomas Jefferson in the same way. Thomas Jefferson, back in November of 1998, a big national news story came out on Thomas Jefferson. At that point in time, there was a story that was written for Nature and Science magazines. The accompanying article was written by Professor Joseph Ellis, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. He said, well, we now know it. DNA testing proves that Thomas Jefferson fathered the children of Sally Hemings. He slept with slave Sally Hemings, and her children came from Thomas. DNA has now proved it. And that story went across the nation. 221 outlets carried the story that Thomas Jefferson had slept with Sally Hemings and produced her children. Unfortunate. Oh, wait a minute, maybe it wasn't, because 6 weeks later, Nature and Science retracted the story and said, nope, sorry, DNA proved just the opposite, proved that he didn't have children by Hemings. Now, that's not the story we heard. 221 carried the initial story, only 11 carried the retraction. Why did they get the story wrong in the first place? Because this Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, just shortly before he wrote this piece, had signed on to an ad in the New York Times opposing something that was happening at the time, which was the impeachment of President Bill Clinton. He was a Bill Clinton fan. And so it came out that, you know, if we can show that previous presidents had sexual peccadillos and they were good presidents, this is really going to help in the impeachment. And it did. This DNA stuff helped in the impeachment. Said, whoa, why are we impeaching Clinton for what he did? Well, look at Jefferson, all he did, and he was a great president. And so this article, this DNA testing, actually ended up helping President Clinton in impeachment, which is what its purpose was, which is why after that was over, they retracted the story. And to this, see, it's fairly interesting. I don't want to get into the science very deep, but let me just tell you something right up front. If you're going to test for paternity from anyone right now, you would have to get their DNA, okay? So, real simple. Well, Jefferson's dead 200 years, so what do? Well, you get the DNA of a male descendant, because in male descendants across generations, the Y chromosome does not change from generation to generation. The Y chromosome of Thomas male descendants is the same today that it was 200 years ago. Only problem was Thomas Jefferson didn't have any male descendants. They didn't use DNA from Thomas Jefferson at all. They did not use any of Jefferson's DNA. He didn't even have DNA. So how did they get DNA proving that he had done this, since they didn't even have DNA from Thomas Jefferson? That's an irrelevant point. We had a story going on. Again, academically, see, a PhD told us this, so we can all believe it now. I recently asked a group of 120 law students I was dealing with. I do a lot of teaching law schools, universities. 120 law students, and they were from about 60 different law schools. And I said, how many of you have been told by your professor that Thomas Jefferson slept with Sally Hemings? 95% of the hands went up. See, this thing is still being taught out there, and it's because a Pulitzer Prize-winning professor said it was so. No, that's not the truth. That's not what it was. Now, in the same way, let me take you into what's called the Jefferson Bible. A lot of people jump me on this and say, how can you say Thomas Jefferson was not an atheist? Look what he did to the Bible. He cut out everything he disagreed with. He cut out all the miracles, and I'll look at them and I act like I don't know what they're talking about. And I say, what are you talking about? And they said, you know, that thing. I said, what thing? Well, you know, the Jefferson Bible. The Jefferson Bible? And then I look at them and say, which Jefferson Bible are you talking about? And they say, you mean there's more than one? At that point, I know they don't have a clue what they're talking about, because there were two Jefferson Bibles that were done. There was one that was done, you know, he went through and cut out those passages, and there was one that was done in 1804, and there was one that was done in 1812. 20. Now, what's the difference between the two, and what's the story? That's actually the picture of the Bible he cut those passages out of. What's this? Now, we're assuming here that if Jefferson cut passages out of the Bible and supernatural, miraculous, stuff that he disagreed with, then we got to assume that he's got an overall problem with the Bible. Fair thing to assume? I mean, if you're cutting out stuff in the Bible you disagree with, then you got a problem with the Bible. So what was Jefferson's view of the whole Bible, the traditional Bible? Well, a couple of things I can point to. He was a member of the Virginia Bible Society, which seems kind of strange because they distribute the whole Bible. They didn't cut anything out of it. He's, as a matter of fact, a lifetime member of the Virginia Bible Society. He gave very large contributions to Virginia Bible Society for the distribution of Bibles. He found out there were people in the state that didn't have a Bible. He said, I can't imagine that. I can't imagine people in Virginia not having a Bible. Here's a really big contribution to help you get a Bible in the hands of a lifetime member of the Virginia Bible Society. He gave contributions for Bible distribution. He also helped print the largest Bible ever done in the United States at that time, called the John Thompson Bible. He also helped print the Woodward Bible, which was an 8-volume Bible that was done shortly after there. He also offered to help print, but it was too late to help print what was called the Thompson Bible. He's into printing Bibles, and he offers financially to help print and produce Bibles. On top of that, you've also got, there's the Thompson Bible. You also have the fact that he gave Bibles to his children and his grandkids. His grandkids talk about when they learned to read, he would give them a Bible so that they would read in the Bible. And he's also in the school board of Washington, D.C. According to the records of Washington, D.C. public schools, by the way, John Adams is the first president to be in Washington, D.C. He was just there for a few weeks at the end of his term, and then Jefferson is the first full-term president in D.C. So they got a brand new public education system in D.C., and they put Jefferson on as president of the board for Washington, D.C. public schools. Jefferson said, I can't be president of the board because I got to be president of the United States, but I'll help with the school board as much as I can. So according to the records of the Washington, D.C. Historical Society, Jefferson's the guy who wrote the plan of education for Washington, D.C. public schools, which used the Bible as a reading text in Washington, D.C. public schools. And their annual reports at the end of the year would talk about how many kids had learned to read out of the Old Testament, how many kids had learned to read out of the New Testament, what Bible verse. Now, wait a minute. If Jefferson's so opposed to the Bible that he wants to chop all these pieces, then what in the heck is he doing promoting full Bibles in so many different venues? Well, it goes back to what was going in 1804. Because when you look at 1804, Thomas Jefferson in 1803 had just been given a sermon by the Reverend William Bennett. Jefferson had great relations with Indians of Virginia. He grew up with them. They were good friends. And William Bennett, evangelical minister, had done a sermon on the Indians and said, if you want to evangelize the Indians, he said, you need to give them a much smaller book to start reading. Don't give them the big Bible. What if they start in Leviticus? What if they start with the genealogies? You know, this is not good stuff. He said, what you need to do is take the highlights of the teachings of Jesus and give them a small book so they can be introduced to Jesus first, and then after that we can get them in the full Bible. Jefferson said, that's a great idea. So what Jefferson did was he took those 2 Bibles out of the White House and he started cutting out passages. Now, it's interesting what Jefferson called this book. This book that he did for the Indians, it's really simple. He took Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's where he cut the passages from, and this is the title he put on it. The Philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth, being extracted from the account of his life and doctrines given by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, being an abridgment of the New Testament for the use of Indians. Now, we do this all the time. We give new believers abridgments to the Testament. We give them the Gospel of John. We give them smaller things to start reading. We have abridgments for kids' Bibles. We teach kids to read by going through Bible stories and highlights and the miracles of Jesus. And so that's what Jefferson did, and it's really what we would today call a synoptic gospel. Because if the parable was in there 3 times, he didn't put it in there 3 times. He put it in there once. If the teaching appeared 4 times, he only put it in there once. He didn't put it 4 times, one out of every gospel. So when that book is all over and done with, and we know what was in it because of the passages he cut from those 2 Bibles, you know, it's kind of interesting. What appeared in that was Jesus raising the dead, Jesus healing the sick, Jesus casting out demons, Jesus the Son of God, Jesus and the second coming, and heaven, hell, and angels. Now, I could be wrong, but that sounds kind of supernatural to me. Raising the dead, healing the sick, casting out demons, Jesus, Son of God, the second coming. And we're told, oh no, Jefferson cut out all the miraculous stuff. What's this? See, this is the 1804 version. That's why I love asking people what they're talking about, because they don't even, to this day, I've asked everybody who's told me about the Jefferson Bible, said, have you ever read it? Well, no, I've never read it. Well, how do you know it cut out all the miracles? Well, that's what everybody says. There it is, academic collectivism. And see, that's what all the scholars and critics tell us, is Jefferson was so anti-religious he cut this stuff out. Not so. Now, that's the 1804 Bible. How about the 1820 Bible? 1820 Bible, Jefferson did something then, as did every student in America, that we don't do today. They studied moral philosophy as a course of instruction in college. Every major university had a professor of moral philosophy. John Witherspoon, great theologian, signer of the Declaration, taught himself moral philosophy at Princeton University. Jefferson had that as a course of study at William and Mary. When he did the plan of education for William and Mary, he made sure there was a professor of moral philosophy. What we did was we studied morals in all the other nations and looked at what worked and what didn't work. And that's what Jefferson did. Do you know Jefferson, in going through his writings, he critiques the morals taught in other nations by other leaders across 2,000 to 3,000 years. And as he went through, I'm going to show you the names of guys that he read their writings and he critiqued the morals in those writings. He critiqued the moral philosophy. I don't recognize a lot of these names that we have here. You see, now some of these I do recognize, but there's a lot of them I've never heard of. Aren't Cicero, Plato, Socrates. I know those guys, Seneca, Cato, Cellus, I don't know, Epicus. A lot of these guys, as it turns out, they all had moral writings. And so what you did was you went through and read every one of these to see where they were strong and where they were weak. And Jefferson did every one of them. You know what Jefferson did? Jefferson compared every one of them. He said, Jesus beats every one of them hands down. There's nobody that comes close to the moral teachings of Jesus. So Jefferson says, if we could get people to live by the moral teachings of Jesus, we would need less government. Remember, he's a limited government guy. He's an anti-federalist. So what he does is he goes through and he prepares the second book, which he calls, this is his handwritten title, The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, extracted textually from the Gospels. What he did was he went through and found 50 moral teachings of Jesus and said, you know, if we can live by these moral teachings, we need a lot less government. So this book, The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, is specifically, has the teaching of the Good Samaritan, the Golden Rule, turning the other cheek, being kind to an enemy, forgiving offenders. It deals with the Lord's Prayer, it deals with the Great Commandment, deals with all these passages on how to live your life toward others. Morality that you owe to God and to man. And that's why the book is literally called The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, how do we get this to be the Jefferson Bible? I'm not quite sure, but what happened was in 1886, Cyrus Adler, the Librarian of Congress, found the original copy of this in the possession of Thomas Jefferson's grandson. When he looked at it, he said, this is a real treasure. So he went to Congress. Congress appropriated the money to buy this book, which is on display right now at Smithsonian, to buy this book from Jefferson's grandson. When it got back, they started looking at it, and Congressman John Lacey of Iowa looked at this and said, this is a phenomenal collection of moral teachings. If we could all live by this, we wouldn't have corruption, we wouldn't have fraud. So what he does was he makes a resolution in Congress in 1902 that Congress reprint that book right there. And that when they reprint it, that they give one to every member of Congress with the admonition that if you'll live by these morals, you won't have. Now, what you have is here is the actual one they did in Congress. I told you we had all these documents. This comes right out of the House of Representatives. They gave this, and this is a photographic copy of Jefferson's own handwritten stuff here. I mean, it's got his stuff all the way through it. They gave this copy to every member of Congress for 50 years. Said, if you'll just live by the life and morals of Jesus, this will be a pretty good place around here. Oh, it's a Jefferson Bible. He cut out everything he disagreed. No, it's not. Read it. It's the morals of Jesus. This is how we live to one another. Now, see, what happened today is all of our professors have told us, oh, no, see, this is nuts. This is academic collectivism. There is no such thing as a Jefferson Bible. He would punch you in the nose if you told him he had written a Bible. That's not what he did. He wrote an abridgment for the use of Indians full of miracles. He also wrote a book on morals, how to live by morals. That's what the two are. There's no Jefferson Bible in there. One other example, I'll give you this. It deals with the Constitution. And by the way, that's why we did the book on Jefferson Lies, is to handle some of this stuff. Constitution, we're told today that this is a secular, godless document. One of the books I love to point to is this book. This is done by two professors from Cornell University. I find this use in universities all over America. As I speak at universities, I say, how many of you have this textbook? Hands go up everywhere. This is quoted by courts of law in their decision. This is quoted in law briefs, in amicus briefs. You see, what we're told by our professors here is the Founding Fathers deliberately wrote a secular, godless Constitution. They didn't want religion to be part of society. They didn't want it to be part of public. They wanted it secular. That's the way those founders were themselves. There's a few religious ones, but by and large they were secular, and they wanted a deliberately secular government. Now, I could show you lots of original documents to show otherwise. What did they base their conclusions? These professors, what's the basis of their conclusions? Well, this is where you go to the back of the book. You go to the footnotes. See what it says here is a note on sources. See the note on sources right there? Here's the proof of why they say the Founding Fathers wanted a deliberately secular constitution. The founders were themselves secular. Look what they tell us. They see here at the bottom, we have dispensed with the usual scholarly apparatus of footnotes. Not a single footnote in the book. But you can trust us. We're PhDs. We're professionals. We know what we're talking about. These guys were godless, and they... See, this is academic collectivism. This is the third thing that gets us, is listening to experts. So, going through this real quickly, academic collectivism, what is the solution for this? Acts 17:11. You remember Paul's on a second missionary journey. He loves Thessalonica. He'd just been there. He wrote 2 epistles back to him that we have in the inspired scriptures. But as he went to the next place, he said, you know what? I love the Thessalonians, but I love these guys even more. They were the Bereans. And why did he love them? Because, you see, Paul has more credentials than anybody in the New Testament church. No question, hands down. His study, his pedigree, his if you will, his doctorates that he had, all the things that he had learned as a great learner and teacher of the law. And he said he loved the Bereans because he said, they refused to believe me. He said, instead, they search the scriptures every day to see if I'm telling them the truth. I keep preaching this stuff to them, but they won't believe me until they check it out for themselves. See, what we learn from that passage is it's truth that matters, not credentials. I don't care how credentialed you are, you want to check for truth. You can have 14 PhDs after your name and still may not be telling the truth. So what you want to do is you want to get the truth. It's truth that matters, not credentials. The fourth trap that I'll point out to you is deconstructionism. Deconstructionism is a steady flow of negatives about Western institutions, beliefs, and values in order to tear down the old certainties on which Western culture is founded. Now, let's deal with this part here about tearing down the old certainties on which Western culture is founded. One of the people who recorded a lot about our Western culture, particularly here in America, was Alexis de Tocqueville. Remember, he did the book Democracy in America. Now, this book, he was here in 1831. He traveled here for 8 months, went back, wrote it all down for France, tell people in France, here's what America is, here's what they're like, here's where they're different. He's the guy who gave us the term American exceptionalism. He says, America is exceptional. I don't think any other nation will attain to what they've attained through there. And he explained why we're exceptional. So if you haven't ever seen that book, here's the book that he did. That's de Tocqueville's original. Here you've got de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. I think this is actually the second edition. First edition is 2 volumes, but you can see how big it is. And we still teach this in university today. Literature classes, American literature classes, kids still study this. AP classes and literature in high school, they'll study this. And what we study is this one right here. It's called Abridged, Democracy in America, Abridged for the Modern Reader. Now, you think anything's missing? It's abridged for the modern reader. What does the modern reader not need to know that they knew back then? If you will take this book and go through it, it removes everything on marriage, on family, and on faith. A couple of references to it. It's loaded up over here. Modern readers don't need to know about faith and family and marriage. No, we'll take that out. We'll deal with economics and prison reform, and that is undermining the values on which Western civilization is based. Faith, family, morality. It's gone for the modern readers. So that's part of deconstructionism. Another example is this book right here. Don't know much about history. This is a New York Times bestseller. It is in most public school libraries. And if you don't know much about history, it's just a little primer. You can open it up and learn little things. For example, if you go over to the section on the American Revolution, say you want a revolution, American Voices, Patrick Henry to the House of Burgesses. You remember this. This is a speech Patrick Henry gave March the 23rd, 1775. And this is what Patrick Henry said. He said, is life so dear, or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? I know no of course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Pretty good. Oh, wait a minute. What's that ellipse right there in the middle? Oh, they left something. See, those dots mean they left something. What did they leave out? They left out 4 words. Forbid it, Almighty God. That's all they left out. Now, don't tell me there's not enough space to be able to put those 4 words in. See all the white space on that page there? There's no shortage of space. But see, we're not going to mention, we'll put an ellipse the ellipse is almost longer than the phrase is. I mean, but they're not going to put God in there. We've got to keep that out of there. Same thing happens when you go to the Mayflower Compact, December of 1620. You've got the Pilgrims who sit off the shore and write the first real government document in America. And look what it says. It says, we whose names are underwritten do but... Uh-oh, another ellipse. What's missing? We whose names are underwritten, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. Really? That's deconstructionism. See, that's tearing down the values on which Western civilization is based. That's making everything secular when it wasn't secular. Now, that's tearing down the values, but the other part that it says is a steady flow of negatives. We do this a whole lot today. This is why people feel like they got to go across the world apologizing for America, because they've been through American education. If you've been through American education, you're really embarrassed about what we got here. If you feel proud of America, you had to learn that somewhere outside of schools, because the way we teach textbooks, it's not pretty. I'll give you an example. Every textbook I've ever dealt with in America will cover the Puritans, and it will always talk about those intolerant Christians. And how do we know that the Puritans were intolerant? Real simple. They had the witch trials. What more proof do you need? Well, and by the way, do you know how many people were put to death in the witch trials? 27. Lasted 2 years. 27 people put to death. 27 people shouldn't have been put to death. But that's not the story of the witch trials. The story is how they came to an end. They came to an end when 3 Christian ministers, Reverend John Wise, Increase Mather, and Thomas Brattle, those 3 went to Governor Phipps. They went to Governor William Phipps and said, Phipps, you have got to stop these trials. Look at the biblical rules of evidence. You're not following the rules of evidence. What rules of evidence? You're supposed to be able to confront your accuser. You're supposed to be able to bring the other side. Proverbs 18:17 says, one side sounds good till you get the other in court to give the rest of. And so what we were doing is we were following European practices on trials, and these 3 preachers went in and said, you've messed this all up. Now, you guys may be aware of a book called Fox's Book of Martyrs. You heard that before? I don't know what you were taught about that, but I was taught that that's a listing of all the people who were martyred in the Christian church beginning with Jesus Christ, right? I don't know, you guys taught that? Turns out that's not right. It's all the people who were killed in the Christian church on the basis of bad judicial process, starting with Jesus. The emphasis was how they were killed, not just that they were killed. And you see what was significant was this Geneva Bible. You remember all the commentaries on this Bible? This commentaries in this Geneva Bible was loaded up with right judicial process. As a matter of fact, if you'll go to the if you'll go to the Federal Practice and Procedure, volumes of books on how to practice law in federal courts, volume 30 has probably 100 pages on how that the Geneva Bible shaped the 4th through the 8th Amendments, almost specifically. The right to confront your accusers, the right to have an attorney, the right to call witnesses in your behalf, the right to have a jury trial. All of that came out of the Scriptures. And the commentaries pointed all that out. They said, hey, over in Europe, they have Star Chamber courts, they have courts of admiralty, they have High Commissioner courts. You don't have juries, you don't get to confront your accusers, you do not have attorneys. I mean, all the stuff we have, they didn't have. And they pointed out that all came out of the Bible. Now, significantly, that's the due process clauses, and that's what these 3 ministers pointed out to William Phipps was not happening. You aren't following due process. We've just had this in Geneva Bible. This is the Bible we brought to America. You're goofing it up. You're acting like we did in Europe. And that's when Phipps went to Judge Samuel Sewall and said, you got to stop the trials. Look what we're doing wrong. And he showed him the Scriptures. Interestingly, Judge Sewall stood up in church and repented for having put to death 27 people innocently because he wasn't following the Scriptures. Governor Phipps then called for a colony-wide day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, seeking to avert God's judgment because they disobeyed what the Scripture said. Now, interestingly, 27 people put to death in America. Did you know which trials were happening across the world at the same time? You know how many people were put to death in the European witch trials? 500,000 put to death. Anybody ever study the European witch trials in history? No. We'll study the 27, but we ain't about to study the 500. After all, we want to look like Europe. You know, we can't talk about bad things they did. Why is it that we hear the 27 and not the 500,000? You know, America's not perfect, but my gosh, it might have been 500,000 if it hadn't been for people stepping in and saying, look what the Scripture says. See, we will talk about the negatives of these guys, but we're not about to talk about the fact that these are the guys who gave us our first Republican form of government. They gave us regular elections. Every year we had elections. They gave us a written constitution and placed limits on government. They gave us the first written Bill of Rights. They gave us public or common edge. All these great things they gave us we still have today, and we're not about to say that. We're going to talk about the witch trials. You see, what's happened is we've learned to have a steady flow of negatives. We'll talk about the exception rather than the rule. I'll give you another one. Indian lands, Indian treaties. We will always point out in our textbooks that settlers stole the land. That's what they did. Came here and took it from the Indians. No, not accurate at all. Matter of fact, the Pilgrims bought every piece of land they had from the Indians. They wouldn't go on it if they couldn't buy it. I mean, they wouldn't live on it if they couldn't buy it. They have title deed. They had the longest lasting treaty with Native Americans of any people in the early colonies because they wouldn't take anything unless they could buy it. Same thing happened when they founded Rhode Island, Thomas Hooker in Connecticut. Thomas Hooker would not let his settlers live anywhere unless they had been able to purchase from the, he had title deeds to everything that they lived on. The entire state of Connecticut was purchased from the Indians at the price set by the Indians. Same thing happened when you got to Rhode Island, Roger Williams. He purchased it all from the Indians, would only let his people live where they had purchased land, wouldn't let them take land from the Indians, had to purchase it. Now this is not what the secular colonists did, but this is what the Christian colonists did. Even William Penn, when he came to America, the king had given him that. The king says, I'm giving you this property to pay off the debt I owe your dad, Charles II, big debt. So gave him the property. Penn got here and said, it's not the king's to give. And he went to the Indian tribe and says, who owns this land? Well, several tribes claimed to own the land because one had taken it from the other and the other had conquered it from. And so Penn bought the land from all the Indian tribes who claimed to own it. He had title deed from several tribes to make sure he had clear title to Pennsylvania. Hey, I thought we stole the land from the Indians. You know, even at the time of the American Revolution, when we did what was called the Northwest Ordinance, the Founding Fathers put together, this is what we said in 1789, our first major piece of federal legislation. Look what it says. It says, the utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians. Their lands and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. This is not the story I heard in school. I heard that we stole all the land from everybody. Yeah, what we're going to get is we're going to get a steady flow of negatives. We're going to get the exception, not the rule. We're not going to get the way history actually happened. A couple of more examples and we'll close down for the night on my part. Slavery and civil rights. I was recently at a black law school, Southern Black Law School. I put up this picture of the Founding Fathers in front of them and said, you know, isn't it too bad that the founders were a group of bigoted racists and slaveholders? And everybody shook their head. I said, by the way, who do you recognize up there? And the only name I got was Thomas Jefferson. He's the only one I got. I said, wait a minute, there's 56 guys up there. You gave me one. Are you telling me that because one guy owned slaves, they all 56 owned slaves? That because one was a slaveholder, they're all racists and bigots? They didn't know how to answer. I said, okay, let me just tell you some you may not have heard about. Let me take you, for example, to Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Rush. These two guys formed the first abolition society in America as an act of civil disobedience in 1774. You see, 1774, we haven't separated from Great Britain yet, but what had happened was Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts had all passed anti-slavery laws. In 1774, King George III vetoed them, said, no, 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 you're a British colony. You can't end slavery over there. You have to, and that's where the Founding Fathers said, great, let's not be British colonies anymore. We want to end slavery, and a number of them did. They started the Abolition Society. Benjamin Rush went on to run the National Abolition Movement. Abolition societies in every state. Benjamin Rush, a huge civil rights leader, actually helped found the first black denomination, trained the first black physicians. Phenomenal what he did. In addition to that, you take Benjamin Franklin again. Benjamin Franklin joined with Francis Hopkins and signed the Declaration. By the way, he's the guy who designed the American flag. In 1768, they started a whole chain of schools for black Americans across America to teach academic subjects, including the Bible. You see, British policy, you can't educate blacks. That's illegal. They said, watch us. We're going to do it in America. So civil disobedience, these guys start education, black schools across America, whole chain of them. And then you have folks like Stephen Hopkins. He's the first governor to sign an anti-slavery law. He tried to do it in 1773. King George III struck it down. Now that we separated from Great Britain, let's try it again. And this time he can sign it and make it law because we're no longer a part of Great Britain. Then we also have folks like John Witherspoon, president of Princeton University, taught black students and white students at Princeton University. Oh, they didn't do that back then? Yeah, they sure did. And on top of that, you've got folks like William Ellery, who did the first national anti-slavery law in Congress. You also have folks like James Wilson, started the first law school. He taught in his law books that slavery is a violation of God's law and nature's law. You cannot have slavery and be in right standing with God. Probably 70% of the Founding Fathers were abolitionists. What happens today is we hear about, how come we hear about the few Founding Fathers who owned slaves and not the many who didn't? I mean, we get this steady diet of the exception and not the rule. We get a steady flow of negatives. The last example I'll show you deals with the faith of the Founding Fathers. We're told these guys are atheists, agnostics, deists. I was recently at a very prestigious law school on the East Coast. I put that slide up, said, who you recognize? The kids got from me Jefferson and Franklin, that's all. They could not call another. I said, there's 56. Who are the others? Don't know. I said, all right, let me take you across the front row. You got folks like Richard Henry Lee. Beside him, you have George Clinton. Beside him, you have Samuel Adams. The guy looking backwards the opposite direction is Charles Carroll. The guy on the front row, light brown jacket, Robert Morris. The guy beside him is Benjamin Rush. The guy leaning on his elbow in the front row, Elbert Sherry. Beside him is Robert Treat Paine. I went through the others, and they said, who? We've never heard of those guys before. We've all been trained to recognize the two least religious Founding Fathers. We can find Jefferson and Franklin. We can't tell you who the others are. Of the 56 guys who signed the Declaration of Independence, 29 of these guys held today what we call seminary or Bible school degrees, which is not bad for a bunch of atheists to have Bible school degrees. Apparently that's what they did back there. So again, you know, we get taught about the few who are not religious, not the many who were. It's a steady flow of negatives. It's the same thing, the exception, not the rule. Now, having said that, that is deconstructionism. What's the solution for deconstructionism? All this negative stuff, all this undermining? The solution is real simple. Romans 12:21 says you overcome the evil with the good. Used to be that we taught history by telling the good, the bad, and the ugly. Today we tell the bad and the ugly. We don't tell the good. We'll leave the good out. The only way you overcome deconstruction is you tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. You tell all the stories. You tell the bad and the ugly. You tell the fact that David slept with Bathsheba and killed Uriah, that David couldn't control his own kids, Adonijah or Absalom, but you also tell that David whacked Goliath. David slayed the lion and the bear. David led that nation to victory and established a covenant with God that's perpetual. That's the good stuff. See, in public school today, we would not teach that part about David. We would teach about his downcomings and his fall. So those are the four traps. Those are the four things you want to avoid. If you can avoid those traps, you can have a right view of history, a right view of God, and you can see stuff that God is up to even at this day. Lots of good stuff going on across the nation. God bless you guys. Thanks for letting me share with you.